Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention? And ladies and gentlemen, trustees, special guests, fellow fellows, welcome. My name is Sean Hinton. I am a member of the 9th Symphony class. Thank you, of Henry Crowden Fellows. And it's a very great pleasure to be here. Very great pleasure to be back here, in fact, as some of you may recall, many, I'm not sure how many gathered here 2 years ago. Let's have a show of hands how many were here 2 years ago. Too many for me to tell the same jokes, I think, unfortunately. Walter made a great point of telling this journalist to write them down so I couldn't use them again next year, which is not charitable at all. Anyway, it is in fact 2 years since our last gathering, and it is so good to see so many new faces, so many friendly ones, some old faces. Francis, friendly but old. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Francis R. Hoffman, the trustee of the Henry and Gladys Crown Charitable Trust. Francis will not be appearing on the stage this year. I got an assurance that he wouldn't be before I came. He stole the show last year completely with a 30-minute monologue about, what was it? Was it about trophies and something? Does anybody? I don't remember. It was a work of genius. It really, don't remember a word of it, but it was extraordinary. Anyway, it's wonderful to see you again, Francis. So many familiar faces, so many special guests, so many of the luminaries of the Aspen Institute are here to show their support. Bill Mayer, of course, is not here so much. Lester Crown, not actually either here. Walter? Walter is here. Walter just made it. Wonderful. Thank you, Walter. The others, they're all here. They wanted to be here. They're with us in spirit, I'm sure. And I'm sure they're thinking of us. They are really... I do see Anne McNulty here, though, which is wonderful to welcome her most generous sponsor of the McNulty Prize, which, as you know, is awarded each year to somebody from the 9th Symphony class of Henry Crowden Fellows. Jordan, and a tradition which will be repeated tomorrow. And the Three Musketeers are here. The Three Musketeers, you know who the Three Musketeers are. Ben, Bernie, they call him Bernie. Ben, Skip, Skippy, Keith, Keithy. Anyway, it's wonderful to be back together. Many of you were invited to contribute to this great gathering of minds. Many of you were invited to contribute by sharing your insights on the incredible projects you've led or the deep thinking that you've done. I was asked to stand up here and introduce people. No, seriously, and Peter explained that this was intellectually challenging for me, and he said that all the speakers had to learn their lines by heart, not just me, and they had to sign binding contractual obligations not to make fun of the trustees, and everybody had to have everything they said vetted by him and the board in writing before they entered US airspace. But I'm not thinking that applies to everybody. I think I may have been singled out, Peter, and I'm not pleased. Anyway, I am English. I thought I should mention that. Maybe that's why I was invited, I don't know. People here think I have an accent and that it's cute. So in case any of you were wondering, I am English, not South African or New Zealand or foreign or whatever it is. But I actually don't live in England. I spend a great deal of my time in Mongolia. I live in China. I grew up in Australia. My wife is from Botswana. So I think I can pretty much offend everyone here tonight quite safely, which I hope I will do. I must say, though, it is an inspiring view. This range of faces and people really, truly from all over the globe. It resembles the diversity of the United Nations, but in many ways, I think the deliberations here surpass institution in the loftiness of the motivations, in the scope of the intention, and it really is inspiration. What, you're laughing? This is the serious bit. That's terrible. It's the only serious bit in the whole thing, and you laughed, and then you didn't laugh earlier when I made the joke. Okay. I'll just get rid of that page. We'll go on to the next one. Anyway, it wasn't easy getting here for some of you. Some of you, I've heard some people didn't get upgraded. Is that... No, that's... Some of the trustees flew commercial. That's not funny, not to be laughed at all. Walter drove here from DC in a Prius. Did you eat like that? But frankly, it's an extraordinary way to be welcomed. Anyway, I was asked to give a short summary of the day today, a sort of a news roundup, as it were. And what a day it was. Apparently, I wasn't here. I landed in Aspen about 45 minutes ago. I got a bit stuck in San Francisco, and actually I had Walter make my plane bookings this morning. I swear I was on the phone. Walter was making the reservation online for me and got me on the flight. In fact, he gave me his seat on the plane to make sure I was here from Denver. Actually, he was trying to make sure I didn't make it to Denver today, but his secretary got the wrong message and I got here ahead of him. Anyway, I will try and do better tomorrow when I've been asked to do another roundup of the day. Now I see Peter giving me the secret. Peter and I have a secret sign. It's like a safe word or something. Do you know what that is? I don't know. Peter said the sign means shut the hell up and get on with introducing the trustees. So let me do that. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Bob Steele, who since November 2008 has been the distinguished chairman of the Aspen Institute. It is a great honor. It is a great honor and pleasure for me. Pause. Bob asked me to keep it brief, but I don't see any need to do that. Last year, I introduced Big Bill Mayer, who's not here, and I was kind of careful, I have to say. Some of you commented on, they said, the kid gloves, you let him get away with it. I was a little bit, I was a little bit nervous. He's a tall man. And since then, I got to know Bill a little. I like to think we've connected a little in this last year, Bill and I, and we had a little personal moment together. It's sort of moment I don't think he's shared with many of you, but something that he and I had together in New York. And he took me aside, and I think with great courage, his feelings had been quite hurt by being left out last year. He felt that I joshed with Walter and I gave Francis hell, and he sort of felt left out. So I told him, Peter told me that, because he had no sense of humor and he couldn't take a joke, and, I should ease off, and I didn't calm him down. It didn't help him too much, but the last thing I want to do is hurt Bob's feelings. So let's get to work on Bob's resume. So, Chairman Bill hands over to Chairman Bob. Isn't that... Chairman Bill to Chairman Bob, and Chairman Bob is going. President Ben is going to speak. Isn't that good? No, that's good. We've got Bob and Ben and Bill. Bob. We don't say Bob where I come from. We say Bob. Bob. Bob and Ben and Bill. Bob, then Ben, then Bill, then Ali Mufuruki and Sibongili Khumalo coming later on. Times are changing, boys. Times are changing. The writing is on the wall. So, Bob Steele. That's an unfortunate name for a banker these days, isn't it? Rob Steele? Rob and Steele? I suppose that's why he's called Bob. Bob was at Goldman Sachs, and I can't remember, can we do Goldman jokes? We can do Goldman jokes? Is Goldman jokes? Actually, I'm carrying a Goldman Sachs card these days, so I think we won't make too many jokes about Goldman Sachs. Let's skip over that sec. But Bob retired in 2004 from Goldman as the vice chairman after 30 years. And that's a round of applause for... Do you really retire from Goldman Sachs after 30 years? Could you call it retiring? Isn't it more like sort of delisting a multinational or sort of like states seceding from the union or something? I mean, 30 years at Goldman Sachs, that's some GDP right there. Anyway, I don't know whether you're nervous about me making that joke or if some of you feel it's a bit too close to maybe I don't know, we'll think about that overnight. So, anyway, Bob, seriously, and this is the second serious bit, so please, this is not the bit to laugh in. Bob is in a great tradition of American bankers with whom Aspen is honored to have had a long and rich association, and genuinely who are admired around the world for having somehow combined the rigors of investment banking with distinguished public service, with a deep personal issues and causes for the betterment of society, and truly, in that regard, are respected and rightly honoured around the world. And it is genuinely a great pleasure to welcome Bob to the stage. I think for the first time as chairman, in front of a gathering of the Global Leadership Network, to address the opening night of Act 2. Bob Steele.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Sean. Pause. It's good to have had you among us for a while. But I now know you have to forewarn people that you're going to be serious, so this is serious for a moment. I do want to say, really, I'm really here just to speak for a moment, and the introduction will be longer than the time I'll speak. But really, I'm here just as a representative of the trustees, and there are many trustees here. As you know, at the Aspen Institute, we have several different activities that we're focused on, and we have important seminars. We're focused on public policy, and we have public meetings and all kinds of things going on. But I have to tell you that there's an especially large amount, certainly what it can be. And it really is exciting when you think about the crucible that begins with 20 fellows around the table. And here today are 165 of you, but yet we have to take the aperture and make it broader and realize there are 800 now and on its way to many, many more. So this idea of scaling from 20 to today's 165 and including all 800, and then closing your eyes and imagining what it can be and what we can take from what we've learned and all the great effect it can have. And we're all excited about that. When some of us who are trustees were talking about, and Peter was such a strong advocate for the success of Act 2, and when he talked to us about it, I think what I would want to implore to you is to say that there's a lot of opportunity and potential here, and please take time to really enjoy and get the most out of these few days. And I guess if I could give some advice, it would be I always like the expression, and I borrowed this from someone else, of punctuation marks. And they tell you that you should pause, and they give an idea. And I think that this is really a punctuation mark where everyone should step back from the normal rhythm of or the normal cadence, and instead should try to have a pause here where they can be a bit reflective and try to just take stock of what's going right, what they'd like to be different, and then try to gather the ingredients for making that difference here at Act Two. So really, all my pleasure is to say welcome, have a great few days, make the most of it, and make it something special. And thanks, Sean.
Bob, thank you very much. Bob Steele, ladies and gentlemen. Gentleman, scholar, nation state. It is wonderful. It is wonderful to be gathered back here in the Dor Hosier building, just on the having had drinks out on the Cato Terrace. Last time we were here, the paint was still fresh on the walls. The little snake thing was still. What is the snake thing? Do you get the snake thing? Goes through the. Did you see the snake thing on the ground? There's a snake. I don't know what the snake thing's about, but there's a snake thing outside with a snake wall, and I think the gold was still drying on the taps when we were here last time, Walter, and it was exciting to be here. Walter was also putting the finishing touches to the sponsorship program for the building then, and I see now how successful you've been since last year, which is really congratulations, Walter. I think deserves a round of applause. I walked past the McNulty room, down the Marjorie Fritton staircase, and I don't know if any of you, it's the small details that you have to notice. I don't know if you noticed the little gold plaques on each of the steps of the staircase, each one named, each one donated. I think it's a nice touch, Walter. I think Walter's MO here is no donor left behind. And I think he's done a wonderful job with that. I took a look at the Adelson Gallery. I have to confess, after my long journey, I had to step in for what we call a little tinkle in the men's room. I must say, I think the Wilkinson Wap Caplet Memorial Urinal is a little... I mean, we call that in poor taste where I come from, Walter, but I think this is the kind of pioneering, entrepreneurial spirit that Aspen has been founded on and continues to bring glory to its name and all the names of all the sponsors. And continuing in that fine tradition of distinguished leadership and distinguished business leaders with impeccable entrepreneurial spirit, let me introduce to you the president of Wofford College, Ben Dunlap, whose first and only business venture involved chickens and eggs and working out which one came first. Ben is less of a speaker and more of a sort of cultural happening. Ben doesn't lecture. He emanates. You're about to experience that. Ben is a man of many words, many words. It was once said of Mahler that he had wonderful moments and terrible half hours. And that too, I think, can be said of Ben. Ben was giving a commencement speech. He was telling me he gave a commencement speech a while ago. By the time he finished, it was a graduation speech. But everybody who hears him is touched by him. We all love him very deeply. We're indebted to him in many ways as one of the shining lights and a mentor to the mentors of this fellowship. He's from a place no one has ever heard of. He speaks in an accent that is barely understandable as English. He turns a phrase like a poet, and his mind goes where others fear to tread. And let me hand the stage over to a very dear friend, Ben Dunlap.
I don't mean to be ungrateful, Sean, but that was not said of Mahler. It was said of Wagner by Oscar Wilde. I had breakfast this morning with Harris Barton, and I told him that I never give a speech like this without preparing two speeches, one from Ben and one from Bernie, and then I try to read the crowd and decide which one to deliver. But Harris said, "Go with the humor, Ben." So I have decided to deliver a speech that begins with a brief introduction of my favorite pre-Socratic philosopher. And I will begin, fellow fomenters, by pointing out that although overlooked until now in our ongoing great conversation, the philosopher Heraclitus, the most fragmentary, enigmatic, and some would say downright funky of the pre-Socratic crowd, is best remembered for having observed that a man's character is his fate. He also noted that time is like a river, and that, as he put it, and as Jorge Luis Borges clearly remembered, you can never step into the same river twice. And yet, here we are, plunging in again for another Act Two convocation. And in a lot of ways, it feels very much like the last time around, except 2 years ago, as we gathered in this very room, arriving as we had from the round earth's imagined corners and huddling together amid such celebrated ghosts as Schweitzer, Pepke, Henry Crown, we had come together to celebrate both a decade of what had been recently dubbed the Aspen Global Leadership Network and the indispensable role of that grizzled son of Canada and Gale, Keith Berwick, who sits among us tonight as irrepressible as ever. Though it may indeed have been a different river from today's, it was exactly at this point in our proceedings that I was asked to address the crowd, and as I surveyed the room, I could not repress the thought that, convening from such origins, united by such common purpose, we resemble nothing so much as a host of Jedi Knights in that scene from the end of the first Star Wars movie, summoned to honor our own revered Obi-Wan Kenobi, while pledging ourselves yet again to fight for the final cause of a good life in a just society, known to all true followers of Mortimer and O'Toole as eudaimonia, happiness of the highest sort. And it was then at that precise point, with that image in mind, that I referred to our AGLN as an intergalactic army of the just. Now, somebody asked me after my remarks if I had been serious about the intergalactic part, and I said, sure. And like the universe itself, we are still expanding. So here we are once more in our expanded, not to say gaseous state, ready to resume where we left off. And the first thing I do is make the mistake of mentioning Heraclitus. And in he saunters, disrupting my metaphor, elbowing Aristotle aside, insisting we acknowledge that it is not just us and the roaring fork that have changed. The universe itself seems to be coming apart at the seams. What with Death Stars exploding and markets melting down in what in happier times we might have called a perennial gale of creative destruction. Back when our ingenuity and boldness seemed more than enough to keep Darth Vader at bay and eudaimonia seemed very nearly within our grasp. Fellow Jedi, what were we thinking? If a moralistic busybody like Seneca the Younger had popped into our discussion, he might have asked sarcastically if ad astra per avarita was our watchword, to the stars through greed. And today he would probably suggest luctor et emergo. I struggle, but I will survive. Or even certe toto, sentio nos incansate non iam adesi. You know, Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. But what does Seneca know about flying into Aspen on an asteroid-battered Millennium Falcon, wondering whether there are signals in the storm to which our overtaxed guidance systems might adhere, steering us not just from success to significance, but, as we now might hope, from fiasco to fulfillment? That is the real question before us, and my answer, fellow Jedi, is yes. And to underscore that optimistic message, I'm going to indulge in a George Lucas sort of prequel that will, I promise, not only illuminate the origins of my metaphorical army, but lead us forward to the hope that happiness of the Aristotelian sort still lies there glittering just beyond the bend. Here's how my scenario begins. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, when I was 17 and just a little under 6 feet tall, I competed for a prestigious scholarship at a college that put its candidates through several days of tests and interviews. One of the tests was the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which made such a deep impression on me that I still remember some of the questions. Do you often have black tarry movements? Truly, that was one of the questions. And is someone following you? I was fairly certain that the question in college was not recruiting brilliant psychotics, so those questions were fairly easy to deal with. I don't know to this day what the presumed significance of black tarry movements might have been, but they sounded like something one ought to avoid. And when I ran into a further question that asked somewhat coyly, would you rather arrange flowers or polish metal? I deduced that a predilection for flower arranging as opposed to the manly activity of polishing metal was probably as undesirable as black tarry movements. So I expressed a fervid dedication to polishing metal. Though I won the scholarship, I did not go to that prestigious college, partly because I'd concluded that 4 years there would probably involve a lot of metal polishing of one sort or another. But the college was generous enough to share with me the outcome of my Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which indicated that I was ideally suited to pursue a military career. Even given my disingenuous approach to the test, I was fairly astonished by that conclusion. Astonished and bemused, because I had grown up amidst such crazed and brawling truculence in South Carolina that I had supposed that I might prefer to be an English professor. But there it was. A man's multiphasic inventory is his fate. And I had apparently inherited a military gene. And sure enough, midway through my sophomore year at a little college named Sewanee in the wilds of East Tennessee, I found myself not only enrolled in Air Force ROTC, but impelled by some obscure compulsion to enlist in its newly organized Arnold Air Society Sabre drill team. As I say, this was all a very long time ago, but despite the distance of years, I vividly remember one of my fellow enlistees, Norman McSwain of Albertsville, Alabama, who, like me, played varsity football and who lived across the hall in our barracks-like dormitory. As a pre-med student, Norman was majoring in biology. As a lifelong dilettante, I was majoring in English language and literature, but we were both out to get a liberal arts education of the first water, one which, like all such balanced approaches to learning, would endow us with a tolerance for ambiguity, a capacity for critical thinking, and an ability to handle complex abstractions. Maybe it was the complex abstractions that drew us so seductively to the Sabre drill team. In retrospect, I cannot imagine why else I would have volunteered when I was otherwise so preoccupied with becoming a beatnik without neglecting my grade point average, unless, of course, there really were genetic sirens singing in my DNA. In any case, it must have been something more than the thrill of twirling razor-sharp swords around my head while wearing slippery cotton gloves. Possibly it was the routine itself, with its macho choreography, immaculately silent, faultlessly obedient to the Busby Berkeley logic of its own expanding and collapsing patterns, not just handling abstractions or creating abstractions, but enveloped by them, caught up like gnats in a furious wind, or musicians in some wild orchestral surge, goaded by that fierce geometry, slashing our deadly instruments through the air like so many Sweeney Todds decked out in Razzi blue. Oh, it all comes back to me now. The martial rapture, the balletic skill, the cool indifference to disaster, riskier than skimming hurdles on our pockmarked cinder track, headier than rehearsing abstract expressionist pass patterns for our luckless football team, or planning daring bombing raids over Moscow in military science. I suspect Even hulking, maladroit Norman must have felt at times like a Nijinsky and Brogans, darting and circling, kneeling in crisp salutes, and rising once more to resume our steady tread, flowering like fleur-de-mal in the botany of Armageddon, a paradigm of creation itself, a human clock winding precisely down to a sudden unanimous halt. I can speculate now that pursuant to some higher meaning, we were handling complex abstractions. But it was not from our instructors that I learned the significance of what we were doing, nor from the despotic Wimple Lyle, student commander of ROTC. It was from Norman McSwain, who in 1957 became a living legend. He was not an instinctive soldier, Airman McSwain, but Sewanee in those days was an all-men's college in the middle of nowhere. So we had lots of time for practice in the humid old gymnasium, our sabers glinting, our puttees shining in the dim shellac of the basketball floor. By mid-spring, we were pretty good. Even Norman could wheel about the gym with the menacing grace of a medium-range tank. And somehow, though nobody wanted to take credit for it after the incident that made us so notorious, word got around that something of martial note was happening in East Tennessee. It was then the fateful summons came. We were invited to appear on the nation's first coast-to-coast TV program, On Today, with its host Dave Garroway, a sort of early morning Johnny Carson in horn rims, whose co-star for years had been a chimpanzee named J. Fred Muggs. Obviously, Garroway knew a class act when he saw one. None of us had ever been to New York, and that alone was an almost unimaginable adventure for a group of student musketeers from Appalachia. We flew up in an empty cargo plane, each with a saber case resembling a sort of golf bag, and we got to Manhattan in time for an evening to ourselves before the early morning performance. The English major and me surfaced as soon as we landed, and I made for Greenwich Village, where I hoped to find large numbers of fellow bohemians, including promiscuous girls with the beatniks in uniform. Norman and Jim McCowan insisted on going with me, which I feared might complicate my efforts to look supremely beat, since even in mufti they looked a lot more like Andy Griffith than Allen Ginsberg. But I need not have worried. The girls weren't interested in any of us, and Norman blended right in. In fact, Norman got drunker, faster, and more picturesquely than any bohemian I have ever met. At 5 a.m., when we started out from McDougal Street for the NBC studios up on 48th, he was still entertaining the villagers with ear-splitting whoops and blood-curdling rebel yells. Tourists and natives alike stood back as Norman at intervals threw up and resumed his whooping. 2 blocks from the studio, he suddenly went limp. At the studio door, he was comatose. Inside, we got the disturbing news that the studio was too small for our routine, so we would have to perform outside on the... The police had put up barricades, but the signature shots of today were long, slow pans of people in the street who, as soon as the camera lights went on, would rush to the studio's plate glass windows and press their homemade signs against the glass for the cameras to read. "Hello, Topeka," they said, and "Hi, Ma, I made it." The people with signs were not going to like it when they were told they'd have to stay away from the windows because of us. But the immediate problem was Airman McSwain. We got a quart of black coffee and made him drink it down. It was like bringing the golem to life. His eyes opened with a ragdoll stare. His feet slapped the pavement like a penguin's. 2 minutes before airtime, he was rumpled but upright. He looked at me and tried to wink, but the effort made him lose his balance. And he had to use his saber like a walking stick to hold himself up. He got the sword back on his shoulder just as the signal came, that in 30 seconds our performance should begin. We stood rigidly at attention as a resentful hush fell over the thwarted spectators behind the barricades, who were restlessly maneuvering to get a little closer to the cameras, waving their giant greeting cards in our faces. The camera lights came on, and Wimple Lau uttered the single savage command that set us irretrievably in motion. Like a band of Midwestern desperados invading the city in a convoy of wheat threshers, our intricate, dangerous machine brandished its whirling blades in the New York dawn. The crowd shrank back as we passed, leaning forward in our wake. I was so intent on remembering the counts that I didn't hear the humming begin. It was Norman McSwain setting out on his own rendition of "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog," reducing our silent drill to a sort of sidewalk bucking wing. I saw Ronnie Palmer duck as Norman's saber whizzed past his ear. "Yes, the one is right," Norman crooned serenely, using a football chair. I started laughing and forgot the count. Wimple Lau was livid, hissing Gestapo-like imprecations to the whole platoon. But Airman McSwain was in the grip of something bigger than Wimple Lau. At the heart of a complex abstraction neither he nor the Pentagon itself could hope to control, careening through our Euclidean designs like a runaway Sputnik. On some sort of automatic pilot, he followed the rest of us down into a Queen Anne salute, the climax of our routine. But coming out of it, I saw him wobble and lurch to one side. And suddenly, the unthinkable occurred. He lost control of his saber. The cameras followed it as it soared in a terrible arc up over our heads, out towards the barriers where the restive mob waited with their signs and shopping bags. Now, though I know you will regard this as fiction or at best as an exaggeration, this is what actually happened. The saber fell like a javelin, point first, towards a bosomy woman with a cheerful salutation for Omaha. She shrieked and fell over backwards as the sword plunged down the front of her dress. The crowd responded with horror as if the Cossacks had arrived. It was live TV at its best. The cameras cutting back and forth from the stampeding crowd to the Alabama assassin, as he would later be called, coolly proceeding with the drill, twirling an imaginary saber as if nothing had happened. In strictly military terms, this might have seemed grace under pressure, what we had been instructed to do if we ever lost our saber. Coast-to-coast television, it came across like the later incident at My Lai. The crowd did not help. Stopping at a safe distance, they turned like extras from the battleship Potemkin, shaking their fists and shouting insults as we finished our routine, and stood in formation on top of their abandoned placards, as harmless now as bowling pins. As things turned out, the woman from Omaha was only superficially wounded. We later learned the network had paid her off in exchange for exclusive coverage of the Fifth Avenue Massacre, as it was dubbed by the Daily News, before we left Manhattan disguised as the undergraduate golf team from VMI. We were never invited anywhere again. And in fact, we disbanded shortly afterwards, returning our sabers to a humbled Wimple Lau, who saw them locked away in a closet in the old ROTC building, where they may be rusting still, except for Norman's, of course, which as far as we knew had been carried off by a Midtown scavenger as a war souvenir. After more than 50 years, I can at last assess that episode with detachment. And what is most salient to me today is an irony unsuspected at the time. In retrospect, it seems to me the point of that debacle is not simply that our ability to handle complex abstractions was tested and found wanting, or even that Wimple Lau's promising military career was under a cloud from that day forward. Airman Lau would overcome that setback and enjoy considerable success in his Air Force career. But the truly astonishing ironies, ones that put me in mind of Mark Twain's mordant observation that Providence don't fire no blank cartridges, boys, derive from what happened to the rest of us. Ronnie Palmer, whom I mentioned only in passing, became a lawyer in an adjacent state specializing in product liability. I myself spent several decades writing and producing for public television as if to atone for my part in that coast-to-coast fiasco. And as for the former scourge of Fifth Avenue, Norman Ellsworth McSwain, I have only recently learned that he became one of the leading trauma surgeons in this country, an expert in emergency medicine and the much acclaimed director of the surgical trauma unit at Tulane University, where I am almost certain none of his colleagues at the beginning of his career back in the spring of 1957, when that 12-bladed abstraction in boots was launched like a dreadnought in the desert. As a footnote to this tale, let me assure you that if his colleagues knew, it would hardly matter, for it was none other than Norman McSwain, whom you saw on the roof of Charity Hospital, continuing to save lives as Hurricane Katrina raged around him. Norman is, in short, a genuine hero, worthy of being dubbed a Jedi Knight. Now, I will concede that the ironies of self-fulfillment are many. It isn't always courage or creativity that saves us from our blunders. Sometimes it's merely luck, or maybe genetic encoding that amounts in effect to Heraclitus's dictum: a man's character is his fate, a woman's too. I'll also acknowledge that skeptics will deride such optimism as looking for the pony in a mountain of manure, though the reason they're wrong is the reason Joseph Schumpeter was right when he spoke of that perennial gale of destruction. Crises are opportunities. The Aspen Institute was founded by Jedi of another generation, Schweitzer, Pepke, Henry Crown, in the wake of a worldwide cataclysm. They were convinced that ideas matter, not dogma or ideology, but the thrust of a freely inquiring mind in consort with other minds. They can't be said to have routed the powers of darkness, but they kept the ideal alive. And that ideal was precisely the same as the one Keith Berwick espoused, which he had learned from O'Toole, and O'Toole from Adler, and Adler from others, in turn from others, all the way back to Aristotle. In the aftermath of the long Cold War that followed that initial conclave in 1949, the Berlin Wall was demolished and the Henry Crown Fellowship created, bringing with it a whole new roster of recruits for what was, in effect, a once-and-future dream of a legion to change the world. That is, of course, a synoptic account of our intergalactic host, the Praetorian Guard of those who would change the world, those whose idea of happiness is productive self-fulfillment for themselves and for everyone else, whose notion of justice is a good life lived by all. It goes without saying that every now and then one of us will lose his saber, sometimes in mortifying ways. But then it's equally true that life has many turns, an epic has many sequels, the river keeps on flowing. And what is my Yoda-like message tonight? As I stepped once again into this turbulent current, I come before you bearing Aristotle in this hand and Heraclitus in that. Think of it as adding a dash of one to flavor the other, if you will, a bit of Ben to sweeten the Mortimer. Let me tell you what else that pre-Socratic oracular Heraclitus has to say. It isn't changing that things find purpose. The way up and the way down are one and the same. If you don't expect the unexpected, you will never find it. The sun is new each day. So here we are then, Heraclitus, tossed together in this promiscuous heap with you and Aristotle, with Lester, Francis, and Muriel, Adler, Berwick, Battle, Reiling, Isaacson, on and on, the numberless ranks of AGLN knights increasing with each passing year. For the moment, ensconced once again in the warm cocoon of our mother ship, we schmooze. In a day or two, we disperse to continue the fight for truth and justice, happiness, as the word is spread from nation to nation and star to star. March on and on, you intergalactic army of the just. You have nothing to lose but your shirts. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have to know when you've been beat. And I can't beat Heraclitus' dictum, nor anyone else's actually. But Ben, you win. It was a wonderful evening. Thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow night. Get some rest. Good night.